Bola Vinaka and good morning to all, to the session chair, all delegates and friends. My name is Viva Tatawaqa and I'm from DIVA for Equality Fiji and member of the Feminist Global Alliance Research. I am grateful to be making this opening statement as part of the major group and other stakeholders. The Women's Major Group and part of many feminist and women-led social movements, networks, and coalitions. As a young woman from the Global South, I am speaking to you at a time when we are experiencing climate, ecological, and political crisis. These crises are rooted in a social, economic, and ecological model that is damaging people and the planet, that is increasingly inequalities and violence, and that is increasing pressure on individuals and communities who are struggling for sustainable livelihoods and access to resources. We have in our hands the possibility to address and end this crisis. The high-level political forum must facilitate a robust, transparent, consistent process that allows for real transformative and change as we work collectively to achieve the vision of the 2030 Agenda and go beyond it. I am not alone. Grassroots communities around the world have been developing and sharing solutions to local needs for water, land, and food and energy with governments and each other. For many years, from anti-plastic campaigners led by Pacific Island women to the solar dryers of the Women's Environmental Program in Nigeria to the Black Mesa Water Coalition in Arizona, and much more. Through public-public partnerships, governments, civil society, and communities are already building sustainable long-term solutions to the crisis we face. The high-level political forum is where we should come together to share real strategies like this and to reject inadequate responses. It is where we should ensure that the roles of multiple actors, but particularly those of communities, social movements, and civil society, are clearly and substantively reflected in the ministerial declaration, as well as in the implementation. National experiences should be presented here as a form of accountability, but this should also be the space where we hear about challenges and structural barriers that cannot be easily solved at national regional levels, so that globally we can find ways to better achieve our common goals. But we fear that the HLPF is falling short in this mandate of being space for accountability. In this moment of crisis, the HLPF offers an opportunity to recommit to multilateralism. Now more than ever, we need strong United Nations engaged in truly meaningful discussions and global democratic decision-making. The major groups and other stakeholders' coordination mechanisms have worked to promote higher standard of participation and accountability into every step of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, and we will continue to do so. Other groups and constituency have also been extremely active and must be recognized in this space, including but not limited to fisherfolk, people with disability, people living with affected by HIV, LGBTQI people, sex workers, people living in poverty, Afro-descendants, people from non-medic society, ethnicity, minorities, and many others. How far are we from achieving the goals of the 2030 Agenda? Far, because governments are still not willing to address the structural barriers that keep us from guaranteeing dignity, rights, freedom, and justice for all. We live in a world where 8 men own more wealth than half the world's population, where 10 corporates have more revenue than 180 countries combined, where 90 corporations, including state-owned corporations, are responsible for 2/3 of man-made global warming emissions, where then $30 trillion sit in tax havens across the world, far more than $3 trillion we need for eradicating poverty. Now it is HLPF, with its theme of eradicating poverty and promoting prosperity, we must ask ourselves, do we need more prosperity and wealth for a few, or just and fairer shared prosperity that benefits all? If it's shared prosperity that we want, we must address unjust financial, trade and disinvestment governance, corporate capture and wealth concentration, land and resource grabbing, and unsuitable production and consumption. We must maintain the connection between the means of implementation in the big picture of the 2030 Agenda. We have to promote policy coherence with financing for development framework so that there is a shift away from the system that is prioritized corporate power and economic growth above well-being persons and the health of our planet. Addressing means of implementation is not about enhancing official development assistance. Although we call for developed countries to fulfill their commitments in this respect, means of implementation should be the entry points for fulfillment of minimum of commitments of the Montreal, Doha, and Addis Ababa FFD conferences for trade, financial, monetary, and economic justice. We must strengthen the role of the United Nations with its universal membership, inclusive nature, and human rights foundations in global economic governance, as opposed to forums like the G20, where a few rich countries set policy that affects all of us. One important way to do this is through an intergovernmental UN tax body with universal membership. We need to ensure coherence between the 2030 agenda and binding instruments, including on trade and human rights, to ensure that the public interests are not corporate profit. It's prioritized in development, policy, and practice. In this rate, it is particularly critical to ensure that governments meet their national and extraordinary human rights obligations. We must reaffirm our commitment to human rights. The 2030 Agenda is not just about achieving a set of sustainable goals or development goals. It is about ensuring recognition, protection, and implementation of universal rights, including to education, health, housing, water and sanitation, food sovereignty, decent work, and living wages in a context of just transition of the workforce and universal social protection. We must end fundamentalism, patriarchy, discrimination, militarization, conflict, and sexual and gender-based violence. We must take real action to achieve gender equality and women's, girls' human rights, including their sexual and reproductive rights. We must stop the narrowing of the threats against spaces for civic participation and civil society. We need to be very clear that the 2030 Agenda is not possible unless gender, justice, social, economic, and environmental human rights defenders are safe from violence, harassment, and intimidation, including by ensuring justice and accountability for crimes that abuses committed against them. We must have a clearer interlinkage and intersectional approach to all SDGs, and one of the issues that we have worked hard throughout this process to indicate this process is gender equality. In regards to Goal 5, states strongly that it's required both specific gender justice focus and gender mainstreaming in national policy plans. This means recognizing the interlinkages between gender equality and all SDGs across 3 dimensions of sustainable development. It is a reality that women and girls of all ages are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Disaster and conflict, especially women living in poverty with disability, LGBTI, older, ill, and indigenous women. Therefore, sustainable development models must be grounded in gender, environmental, and economic justice. Gender pay gaps, underrepresentation in decision-making spaces, informal and precocious forms of work, attacks on bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive rights, and other obstacles impede in the full realization of women's human rights. Gender equality is a macro agenda and the only way to achieve in many guaranteeing women's rights, transforming the sexual division into labor and eliminating patriarchy in all areas of societies. We should open our eyes that start seeing the generated impact of all our actions rather than promoting instrumentalism, business as usual interventions that women all over the world receive. I would like to speak on SDG 14, Oceans, and build on the increased momentum following the first UN Oceans Conference this year. As the President of the General Assembly has said, we can no longer say that we are unaware of the extent of trouble we have brought upon the ocean. By 2030, it is estimated that there will be more plastic than fish in our oceans. Today, nearly 90% of global fish stocks are either fully fished or overfished. Meanwhile, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development forecasts a 17% in fish production by 2025, in part to meet the unsustainable overconsumption of fish in developed countries. At the same time, corporate-driven agendas are being moved in the Clarion-Clipperton zone to begin unfeasible experimental seabed mining. This at a time when it is clear that we must quickly move away from further exploitation of the ocean, which is already so depleted, dirty, and polluted so much alive. In these facts alone, our urgency of this agenda is unbeatable. This is shocking for me as a young Pacific person. For most of my region of 22 Pacific small island states and territories, the ocean is the source and enabler for our lives and those of other species. For most of my people, there is no alternative to ocean's livelihood and economies. In smaller Pacific and Caribbean states and tens of thousands coastal villages in every region, we do not have any other options of large-scale agriculture, even as those systems that are under severe threat. This is about the right to life, and this to just, sustainable, and ecological-based economies. The health of our oceans, land, and air will determine whether and how whole societies around the world will survive, thrive, and experience sustainable development at all, whether we will live at all. Finally, Chair and fellow delegates, there is precious little time left to tackle climate change ahead of us moving into equitable, just, and safe transition to a sustainable development future. Our response to this universal challenge must be based on common but differentiations, responsibilities, and respective capabilities, and it must be of the state required. The damage done to our planet, all species, and our society is now so great. As we break through more planetary boundaries, we cannot be speaking on sustainable development while advancing policies and roll back progress on climate change. And in a spirit of accountability, there cannot be silence from other states when this happens. The 2030 agenda applies to all countries because they are such about societal practice and economic policy in the global north as in the south. And when it comes to ocean and climate change, these are two clear examples where developed countries must also be accountable. This is a time of urgency. It is a time for revolutionary and transformative change. Our lives and our planet depend on this collective work, including during the 10 days ahead of us here at the high-level political forum. Thank you for listening, Chair, delegates, friends, and good luck and best wishes for all of us that will be here for the 2 weeks and in the hard necessary work ahead. Nakava level.